The new land revenue settlements that the British East India Company introduced benefited the British colonialists and their Indian collaborators. But their impact devastated the common peasantry. Cultivators enjoying hereditary occupancy rights over land gradually turned into landless labourers and were pushed into perennial indebtedness. In the earlier episode, Dr. Amit Bhattacharya discussed these problems with respect to Eastern India and Southern India. Now, he will discuss the state of peasantry in Northern and Central India as also in Western India.
In this region, as we know, Mahalwari settlement was introduced. In the western and southeastern regions of the Punjab, the peasants were drawn into the whirlpool of commerce by a number of factors such as excessive revenue and rent, insecurity of harvest, owing to low rainfall, infertile soil, lesser irrigational facility, etc. And there was a mixture of trade and money lending, and that produced a system of the Dadon type, and it was very strong in those areas. The situation, of course, was different in central Punjab and the canal colonies, which were more advanced, more fertile regions anyway. And then there was the opening of the Suez Canal and the spread of the railways, which opened up new demands for food and non-food crops. And the credit market entirely was called by the moneylenders. And so when the peasants failed to pay off their debts to the moneylenders, they had to part with their small plots of land. So this was the situation there. And in Jhansi, one can point out in the Jhansi region by the early 1870s, in the wake of the severe local famine of 1868-69, there was evidence of rapid penetration of Marwari moneylenders who gained control over land. It has been pointed out by Eric Stokes that by 1874, even in a region called Mott, which was the richest Pargana in the Jhansi district, it was found that the whole profits were taken by the Marwaris, and no settlement of accounts takes place between them and their creditors, peasants and the creditors. In the central provinces again, indebtedness took the shape of a direct confrontation. Yes, the peasants, of course, they revolted. All the peasant rebellions, peasant risings in this period, after the introduction of the new land settlements and new measures, these rebellions were responses, reactions to the very critical situation. And there was direct confrontation between the toiling peasant and the Marwaris and the Parwar moneylenders. In Western India, commercialization of agriculture got an impetus, particularly in the 1860s, when the American Civil War stopped the export of raw cotton to Britain, and as a consequence, Britain had to fall back upon Indian cotton for supply. And side by side, there was the expansion of the railways and irrigational facilities, and all these also helped cash cropping and exports to other regions in a very big way, particularly sugarcane in the Deccan and Gujarat, tobacco in Gujarat, groundnuts in Satara, and cotton in Gujarat and Deccan. Now, it has been pointed out by Fukazawa that the great expansion in internal external trade had given the village moneylender the freedom to maneuver. He had more maneuvering capacity, and as the sale value of land increased, land became more precious. The courts, the system of justice, they could enforce the transfer of land for recovery of debt. Transfer of land for recovery of debt. Because they were indebted, and so they had to part with their land. And here, the peasant, many a time, the peasant opted for a new bond for a higher amount of debt rather than transfer the land. When a peasant failed to pay off his debt to the moneylender, he would have to part with it. Many a time what it did was he borrowed money again to pay off that debt, maybe from the same person, and was further immersed in debt, more and more indebtedness, just in order to save his land, his small plot of land. But he did not know that he can't save it. It all will go. That was the situation. And naturally, it only further strengthened, it tightened the moneylender's grip over the peasant. Neil Charsworth, in his study, points out that Marwari and Gujarati moneylenders in the Deccan did not own more than 5% of the cultivated area. He says that 10% of the cultivated area may have changed hands between 1883 and 1891, and the extent of mortgages was much larger. That is, if a peasant failed to pay off his debt, he did not part with his land, but he again mortgaged it. He again took loan, borrowed money. So this land still belonged to him, theoretically belonged to him. So there was an addition to lands which were mortgaged, not a transfer of ownership, but an increase in the number of mortgage lands, because the peasants, they preferred to get further into debt by mortgaging his land again, to selling it outright, or to parting with it, to being compelled with parting with it all outright. This is the situation. And the rich farmers often replaced the traditional moneylenders. Charles Watt says that rich farmers replaced the traditional moneylenders as sources of credit in the village. And in the central Deccan too, the professional moneylenders were in firm retreat after 1900, with the emergence of new breed of new rural elites, landed elites, moneyed people. So the professional moneylenders, they retreated after 1900. That is what we find in Western India, some parts of Western India. There are different features in different areas, but still we have some common features. Now, in the new climate created by the British Raj, usury had a phenomenal growth. Everywhere that is common. And for meeting the exorbitant demands for land tax or rent, and also for his subsistence, and not for investment in productive activities. That is important. The peasant was compelled to depend on the usurer. He is borrowing money to pay off his debts, to pay off his rent, for his own subsistence, but not for an agricultural improvement. How can he go for agricultural improvement when he can't make both ends meet, when he is simply dying out of undernourishment, impoverishment, etc. And the usurer made it comparatively easier for the colonial rulers to realize both the land tax and the rent, land tax for the Jamindar, rent for the peasant, who also both of them took loans from the usurer moneylenders. Irfan Habib observed that usury became an inseparable aspect of the transformation of the Indian agrarian economy brought about by colonialism itself. So usury was a new development, particularly a very intensive kind, very rigorous, very intensive kind, very oppressive kind, but feudal in nature. Not capitalist in nature, but feudal in nature. Because the system that was functioning was colonial and semi-feudal. It is not a capitalist system which was functioning. That is important. In colonial India, so what we see is that usury capital sided with colonial power, and it serviced a mechanism of tribute extraction. Okay. It also caused other things. It also caused disintegration of the small peasant economy and ruined both the peasants and the artisans. Artisans were also ruined because artisans also had to take loans, had to borrow money. not just the peasants but artisans also. And the result was further pauperization of large masses of the peasants and artisans, and a wide prevalence of debt bondage. So we have debt bondage, new developments, common features. Now, besides debt bondage or bonded labor, prevalence of bonded labor or appearance of bonded labor, we have a new kind of serfdom also, serfdom. With the penetration of commodity money relations into the countryside, the ownership of land was increasingly transferred from the peasants to a new breed of usurer come traders, moneylenders, middlemen, etc. And when the peasants were forced to sell their holdings or lost them to the mortgages, they were not driven off the land, but they were bound to it again by the new owners and tilled it on a sharecropping basis, crop sharing basis. He was tilling his own land, knowing fully well that this land no longer belonged to him. He's a sharecropper only, not the owner of his own small plot of land. And so this usurer landlord sees most of the products, the surplus product, everything, no surplus product was available there, the surplus product as also the necessary product of the peasant's labor without making an investment. So what appeared was a parasitic landlordism. It's a parasite, nothing else. According to Gopal Krishna Gokhale, about 1/3 of the total number of peasants, 1/3 of the total peasantry, ceased to be owners of their land and became serfs of the moneylenders. They became serfs of the moneylenders.
Sir, was rural indebtedness greater in British India as compared to pre-British India?
Actually, one cannot say definitely whether it was greater or less, but rural indebtedness was there both in feudal India as also in colonial India. If we talk about, we have referred to some facts about the Maratha race, etc. Anything. One can only talk about the Mughal period when there was a Jagirdari crisis. And the Jagirdari crisis, contributed to much rural unrest. Many people they were forced to leave their villages and to take shelter in other areas. There were some rebellions also in many areas under Mughal rule. And Irfan Habib, in his study on agrarian history of Mughal India, has referred to many such instances. We have other works also by Gautam Bhadra and others, which shows definitely that rural indebtedness, rural discontent, exploitation in various forms, in feudal exploitation in various forms, definitely contributed, led to rural indebtedness. And there was also mass migrations during the Mughal period. But what one can say is that in British period, probably it was more intensive in kind. Oppression was more intense. There was no drainage of wealth from India. In the Mughal India, we do not witness any drainage of wealth. But in British period, definitely we witness. And it was this drainage of wealth which exacerbated the crisis, the situation of rural indebtedness, peasant pauperization, impoverishment of the peasantry, which definitely was not a feature of the earlier period. So, if we take all these things into consideration, one can say definitely that it was the period was worse. The period was definitely worse than the period of Mughal period. So it was more intense and more critical situation.
Sir, according to Marxist theory, we find the pre-colonial Indian villages to be self-sufficient. But advent of the British meant advent of capitalism. So, with the commercialization of agriculture, how far did India become a part of the world economy?
Before the advent of colonial rule, Indian economy was definitely more or less self-sufficient. It was not totally isolated from the outside world, because we know that Indian, particularly the merchants of Western India, they were some of the richest merchants in the world at that time. And there was external commerce, external trade and commerce. So India definitely was in contact with the outside world during the period when India was independent, before the advent of British rule. But when the British came not only as foreigners, but they also came with a new system. Their coming to India was an integral part of the development of a system, that is the capitalist system, which advanced into imperialism in course of time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Britain definitely took the lead. Britain was not alone. There were other capitalist countries also, but Britain definitely took the lead. And the whole world, or the major part of the world, became part of the British Empire at one point of time. And naturally, they colonized many areas, many countries, and they looted, they plundered, they looted, they plundered their wealth, they plundered their raw material, they sent their finished goods, industrial goods, textile goods to different parts of the world, and in this way also captured the market. So there was it had its effect not only on agriculture, but also it contributed to the ruin of the handicraft industry of India, as also in other parts of the world. So Indian economy became part of a global economy. India itself was converted into a raw material supplying appendage to metropolitan Britain. Indian cotton was shipped to Britain, to Lancashire, Manchester, and then we have the finished products, those which were then again exported to India, and of course to other parts of the country also. So in this way, it became part and parcel of a global economy. It did not remain isolated. In earlier period, it was more or less the fluctuations in the world market did not hardly touched the Indian economy, hardly touched. But now it definitely touched, because it became part and parcel of a global economy. Now we will make a brief summing up of what we have dealt with so far. What we have discussed so far is that colonial rule brought about a transformation of the Indian agriculture for the worse, no doubt about it. There were 3 land settlements introduced from the late 18th century in 3 different regions, and accompanied with it there was commercialization of agriculture, all of which caused depeasantization, rise of usury, debt bondage for the peasants, sharecropping, and the emergence of a new type of serfdom. Old feudal society was dismantled, but what arose in its place was not a capitalist society, but again a semi-feudal society on a new basis. In fact, colonial rule brought about what Andre Gundar Frank described in his analysis of Latin American countries, in Chile and other countries, the development of metropolitan Britain. It was the development of metropolitan Britain at the cost of the underdevelopment of India, colonial India.